people of color whose experience maybe didn't match that, or now they're thinking about their experience in a different way, and figuring out how what I'm teaching about is influencing the folks who are in the room. I think that one's a really tricky one that I don't have a great answer for yet. Who is writing about relevant topics? How can I incorporate the voices of academics, activists, and others? So getting away from just using Google Scholar to populate my syllabus. And then how can we measure this learning? Should we try to? What does that look like? I have some ideas on that one. And lastly, how can I create channels of feedback that will allow my students to hold me accountable? So, if I start with the first question, how can I enact justice and equity in my course? I have to find ways for folks to let me know when I'm getting it wrong. I feel like I've done this one pretty well, which means that a lot of times I'm like, oh gosh, I've made a mistake and someone's told me about it, which is both good and I am not yet immune to it. I'm always like, ooh, crushing blow. But I think that some of my channels for feedback are pretty good. Okay, so why do I do this? Good teaching pays attention to the challenges of folks who are racial minorities, who are disabled in ableist spaces, how gender plays out in the classroom, the role that fat phobia plays in sport and exercise and in academia. So we're like learning more about the way, or paying more attention to the ways that these things play out in the classroom and in sports. And so thinking about how I teach and what I teach and the way to identify these, not just intellectually, but sort of in practice, as well as national news and politics. I think increasingly we're seeing students who are stressed out or even potentially traumatized by what's occurring on a national stage, and trying not to let that influence their education negatively. And then COVID, trying to think about these things and with the emotional, financial, physical stressors of COVID. Plus, as somebody said when we did the human barometers, many people said, like, sport is a place where oppression and resistance and protest are playing out constantly, have played out historically. This is like, I want to teach about all these things, and I want to think about the big pictures. And I think that we can do all that while teaching about sport. This is Liz Dawn, or the person in the wheelchair is Liz Dawn, who might be the first woman on the wheelchair rugby team for Team USA at the Paralympics. It's a co-ed team. They just don't normally have women. There's no men's wheelchair rugby. It's co-ed, and she would be the first woman that they've had make the team. So that's kind of cool. I included her there. So my questions are informed by what I know about trauma-informed knowledge, making academia less rigid, feminism, critical race theory, queer theory. I like to throw queer theory, and I know a little bit about it, but don't question me too much on that one. And then the privilege to teach these classes. So there's folks on this call who I think have talked me through syllabus decisions. And Barbara's here, who helped me propose my exercise in Sport for Social Change class. Diane Williams is here, who we spent, 6 hours in January talking about how to teach about sports. So the community, I think this community really helps us think about these things. Okay, so here are some of my answers. In order to open those chains of communication so I can enact equity and justice in my class, having a pre-semester check-in. I've been using a Google form for a while now, which asks things like, what name should I call you? What pronoun should I use for you in class? What on the syllabus have you seen that you're interested in or worried about? Is there anything else I should know? Give students the chance to say things like, oh, I'm struggling with anxiety. Oh, my parents have a health condition that I'm worried about. That I think right from the start opens up a connection that I wouldn't gain otherwise if I didn't, because it's hard to check in with everybody in person. So doing it this way, I think, helps. Or I used to do, and I probably might return to, the first day of class note card, which asks some of the same things. I also like to include, why are you taking this course? Because it gives students the chance to say that they like me. And so that's a good ego boost too. Get to class early and stay late. I even do this on Zoom. I use the waiting room function. So I try to let a couple of people in early every time so I can chat with them for a couple of minutes to see how they're doing. Every class, I do something called a chat box check-in on Zoom, or warm-up activities in person. So this week, I asked my grad students, what would your 5-year-old self be proud of you for? And so someone said, like, oh, I have a dog who can pull me on my bicycle. And I'm like, that is a great answer. But it builds community, and it opens up this sense of, like, we're like communicating back and forth. And I think that that really helps people feel connected to each other and like they have a voice in the space. And then mandatory office hours for about a year and a half now. I've made sure that everybody comes to office hours, either in groups or individually, just so they know where my office is or how to get there on Zoom, and we have a chance to check in. Creating community, I create groups as mindfully as possible. So trying not to isolate people who have visible, like marginalized identities. Like if I have people of color, if there's 4 people of color, I don't want to put them in 4 different groups, especially if we're talking about race, right? Because then there's this idea of stereotype threat, identity tax. These folks are going to do the heavy lifting for that group. So really creating groups mindfully. Helping students get to know each other. I really don't like the feeling of like everyone's talking to me, they're not talking to each other. So doing things like person bingo or name quizzes, practicing vulnerability before it becomes necessary. So having students role play conversations, doing debates, having them share a little bit of vulnerable making information with their classmates so that later if they have to call somebody in and say, hey, that thing you said didn't feel great to me, they've already sort of practiced how to address people, how to be a little bit vulnerable. And then allowing for various forms of participation and sharing, like the chat box check-in, like small group warm-up conversations. This is classmate bingo. Content. So I think this is sort of, I don't know, I think there's 2 big pieces, right? Content and then how to manage the classroom. So teach with the knowledge that academia is fallible and that subjugated forms of knowledge are important. So I've really been into like finding blogs and finding folks, like asking students to help me identify like who's writing about this. Like our students, our undergrads, especially at Smith, are very engaged. And so asking them to help, like I've been doing this thing now, I guess just since last semester, where I have people co-teach with me for one class. I'm like, here's what I would teach. Here's what I'm planning on doing. What would you like to bring into that? That really gives students the chance to help me learn different sources. And then go big and thinking about like structural oppression, and then help students connect it down to their own sport experiences. In class this semester, an activity that I stole from Diane was like asking students to think about how their gender was socialized through sport participation, not just reading about gender socialization and sport as creating and supporting hegemonic masculinity, but like, how does that influence you? So some of the things that I'm thinking about this semester when I'm thinking about going big and then coming small. So redlining, like this is not a sport topic, but I'm like, oh, what are the effects of segregated housing on recruitment patterns for collegiate sport and how people have access to high school sports or club sports, like getting students to think that big, right? Or I'm having them listen to the Throughline episode from NPR about the history of athlete activism. Like, how can that influence how they talk to their student athletes if their student athletes want to take a knee or don't want to take a knee? Thinking about fat phobia, we're going to read this article about everything you thought you knew about obesity is wrong. Like, how can that influence the way that they think about enacting weighing processes or what they think about as health or performance in their classes? So really trying to take things that are not sports specific, that are big picture, and have them use those to examine their sport practices. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about this year. Lastly, learning and assessment. I've been thinking a lot about trauma-informed things recently. So thinking about diminishing uncertainty in my classroom. That means like, if I'm going to do chat box check-ins, I do it every day. If I'm going to do small groups, this is how we run them. I give them grading policies. I say, okay, this will be back to you in 2 weeks. Here's how I grade things. Lots of low stakes assignments and assignments that require reflection and synthesis. Sometimes I say like, okay, if people do the work, they're gonna do well in my class. It's sort of like you have to try hard not to get a good grade. And that means oftentimes it feels like a lot of busy work for me and a lot of grading, but I just think having students engage with and grapple with the material really helps. All right, and then this is my last demo of a practice that I try to do, but I usually fail at this one because I'm always out of time. But an exit tickets would be like, okay, before you leave today, hand me a piece of paper with something on it, or I'm gonna ask you to put in the chat box one takeaway, one reflection, one question or one theme that stood out to you. And I will reassure you that my colleagues will talk more about content and what they put on their syllabi. So you can put it in the chat, or you can draw it, I guess. But tell me your exit ticket thoughts. What stood out to you? Is there anything in the chat? Put them in the chat. Yeah. Great. All right. I'm going to stop my share. And wow. Thanks, everybody.
I didn't know if you wanted to address any things that were in the chat, or if you wanted to wait until the end to talk about it, or if you just want to read them. Because
I just want to read them. I'm like, people are listening.
All right, so I'll go ahead and I'll start sharing on my side. All right. Well, hold on just 1 second. I actually have to switch where this was because I've got 2 screens here and it's making me share the wrong one or the right one, but where my camera is. There we go. Go. All right. We can all see this, correct? Because I feel like everyone says that when they're just starting out. All right, I'm gonna start my timer so I'm cognizant of my time. All right, so my topic, I mean, we're all gonna be talking about social justice in classes. I'm gonna really focus on the concept of building classes with social justice and how I go about doing it. And I'm gonna provide you with some of the sample syllabi that I've utilized and also some sample assignments. So in terms of utilizing social justice in class, these classes are gonna be a little bit more broad spectrum of kinesiology. But there are ways to implement it into a sport psychology specific pedagogy. So just some background for context, because I think it's really important to recognize my place in this. So I grew up in Bangor, Maine. And if y'all don't know where Maine is, see, I just said y'all, this is what happens when you live in the South for so long. It's the most northern eastern state. So I grew up in a very openly liberal house. My mom was the breadwinner of the family. She's in STEM. She's a chemical engineer. She's also a first-generation college student. She's an immigrant from the Philippines. My dad is an Irish man. He was a 5th grade teacher. So my parents were very different in terms of the stereotypical roles that we might see in a male-dominated or a female-dominated field. So fast forward however many years it was, and I'm in Augusta, Georgia now. So I'll be honest, a lot of the time I feel very out of place sometimes in Georgia, but I tried to use that as a sign that I'm here for a reason and that my teaching is important, because I think that what I have to offer is really valuable. So looking at what I do at the institution, so I'm an assistant professor. July 1st, I will transition to the associate role. Very excited. I've been the program director of our undergraduate degree for the past maybe 3-4 years. And then I'm the department's go-to for anything that they need to know about diversity, which has its pros and its cons, especially when it comes to academia, because we all have that diversity training that we're supposed to do, yet it's almost like they just click through the buttons and don't actually try and learn anything. And then they code the same person every single time, as opposed to figuring out how to really infuse that into their teaching. So specifically within my department, I teach the following classes that are up there. Oh wait, and that should actually say thanks Tibbs to the 3rd bullet point, because she was the one that provided that shell of that class. And it's a wonderful, wonderful class. And then the working with diverse populations, that's actually one that I'm currently working on because of this 2nd bullet point. One of my other roles is that I'm the internship coordinator for all of our undergraduates, and they each do a midterm, or their supervisors fill out a midterm evaluation and a final evaluation. And over the past 4, 5, 6 semesters, the number one thing that I get back on those is that the students are very smart and they're great to work with and they try hard, but they don't know how to work with people who are different from them. They don't know how to engage in conversations. They don't know how to change their dialogue, or they don't know how to really create some sort of rapport with their clients. And then the third bullet point about the 1/3 of a department chair, a year and a half ago, I was asked to take on about 1/3 of the department chair roles due to some things that were happening in our college. And so I was privy to some of the things that faculty don't typically recognize when it comes to developing courses. And so that's something that I'm going to talk about as we think about what it takes to get one of these courses in place. All right, so determining the need for a course. The silly part is that, especially when it comes to social justice initiatives and social justice work, all of us here recognize its importance. But when it comes to the pitch, which I'll talk about in a little bit, we have to be able to justify why it's important. We have to look at what does the institution have and what do we have in the department. At our institution, I think we've got a diversity class in psychology, and I honestly think that's about it when it comes to working with diverse individuals. The second thing when thinking about a syllabus is looking for a book. And we have seen some books come out lately, which has been wonderful. But in the grand scheme of working with diverse populations from a kinesiology umbrella, there's not much out there, if anything. It's very content specific about sports medicine or something else more specialized. But in thinking about that, that's where that third bullet point comes in, because I've had to really consider what are my alternatives. And I found out that alternatives are actually a better option. One, it doesn't cost the students anything. So we really consider, cost of textbooks. I think the sports psych book that I use is like $137 or something like that. And if you use things like peer-reviewed journal articles that you can disseminate to your students, it doesn't cost anything for them. And then when you think about research, it should constantly be updated and it should be changing. So every time you teach this class, a diversity related class or a social justice related class, all that material can be updated, and it should be updated to be very relevant for what you're about to teach. The hardest part for me in developing these classes is trying to figure out what I want to include. And when I talk about a couple of the smaller classes that I've taught and created, you'll understand what I mean. When it comes to like those long 16, 18-week semester courses, we're still not going to be able to cover everything. And I think that's what's frustrating, is because we want to give them so much knowledge and so much information and cover as much as possible, but it just does not, there's not enough time. And so my second bullet point is really a suggestion to those of you that are thinking about how can I create a course like this and be inclusive of a lot of topics. So I created a list of all the things I wanted to cover if I had enough time, and I prioritized them in what I thought was the best order. And then I asked 2 colleagues to do the same, and then we cross-compared our lists so that we were representing what we believed would be the best topics for our students. And then we took a look at what was available, all in those other documentaries, peer-reviewed journals, opinion pieces, and the like. So for the administrative part, a lot of the things that I really considered was who will teach it. So we're all given a faculty load and can't really go above that. And if we do, what do we give up? So for the working with diverse populations class, I'm actually not going to be able to teach that, which really breaks my heart because I already have a 3-3 load. And if I taught that class, I'd have to give up something else. And I really love all the other stuff that I have as well. So it comes down to who can teach this and also who feels comfortable enough to teach this and can teach it in a way that the students are going to gain something from it. And then also thinking about the track sheets and the curriculum changes that have to go through it. ours have to be in the system by October. And then if it's not, then you have to wait a whole other year for it to go through the system. And then you also have to think about, well, how many credits do the students take? Where does that go on the track sheets? Is there anyone that's going to be kind of a stick in the mud when it comes to getting it through? We developed a health promotion degree that took 3 years to process because we had one person who said that they didn't like it. And so it finally got approved, but it took a lot longer than it should have. So this is what worked for me. Our department chair is extremely supportive. He actually came to me and asked me to develop it because I had been talking about doing it for a very long time. So when I went to the first faculty meeting, I had a mostly finished syllabus, and I'm going to plan on showing that to you in a second. And then I also showed every single concentration and where the changes would come so that no person in that department thought that I was coming at them from, on a blind spot. And then I presented them with research and statistics about why this is important, and then really supported that through the internship evaluations. And then I opened the conversation and asked for suggestions. And we had really good suggestions. And luckily, because I guess, marketed it or advertised it in a certain manner, it was very well received. And hopefully we'll be able to get the changes in by this October so that in 2022, it can become a class. So I had the privilege of creating 3 classes in what I think is a great place to start if you think about what your institution is like. So Inquiry 1000 is a 1-credit, 10-week course. It's very similar to like an FYE class where every single freshman or sophomore or transfer student, every single person that's a student has to take one of these classes. And so the incentive for the professors is that we get $1,000 of professional development, which is really helpful. So this is one of the first ones I created about social and activism in sport. And we highlighted different athletes. And each week they had to read something or watch something and then respond to it. And they all had to do specific discussion questions, but then also do a journal reflection that only I saw, so that if they were uncomfortable posting something on the public board, they could say it within their journal. The other one that I created was called LGBT Heroes, Athletes as Allies. And then on the left-hand side are the topics that we covered. And on the right-hand side is pretty much what the class was about. When I was trying to create this class, I was trying to figure out what's the best way to start. And honestly, terminology, I think, is one of the easiest, let me rephrase that, is one of the, I think is the best place to begin, because living where I live, it's a very conservative area, and there's a lot of misconceptions and myths and poor usage of words and inappropriate usage of words that I hear constantly. So I think terminology was a great place to start. And then the unconscious bias and the implicit bias really helped to tie those topics together. And then finally, the class that Tibbs really created that I had the pleasure of utilizing, I pared that down to a 1-credit class. So it's not as extensive as what they would do in 3 credits, but we do cover a variety of different topics throughout the 10 weeks that we're together. And at the end of the semester, or the 10 weeks together, they have what's called an expo project. And I'm going to share that assignment with you all. So these are my sample assignments that I'm going to share with you. Hopefully I practiced this, I think. Did I practice it? I think I did it right. Okay. So for my inquiry class, just for sake of time, I'll just do the expo one. So the expo project was a group project where they had to work together and create a presentation. And so this first one was the one that we did for the Athletes as Allies. So they had to profile an athlete or an athlete ally. Then they had to profile an ally organization. For the social in activism in sport, they had to choose an athlete activist who we hadn't covered. for the previous 10 weeks. And all of them have a specific question that their group has to answer at the end. So this one was, should athletes use their platform or should they stick to sport? The sport and exercise for social change. This one is probably the most extensive. These have the most extensive guidelines, but the projects that come out of this, I think, are really fascinating. And so up here, what I've done is I've just chosen a couple. So this is one group who chose Megan Rapinoe. This is the athlete, I think this was the athlete activist one, or social activist. And so they profiled her, and then they talk about why her advocacy is important. They talk about what she has done for the league, for women's sports. It's very fascinating to see how in depth some of them have gotten. And then they always end it with asking the question or answering the question. For those that chose, or for the LGBTQ Heroes one, they did Chi alums, and they profiled Chi alums, talked about their experience and the role in the LGBTQ community. And then they also profiled Athlete Ally. And so these types of classes, our students don't get here because there's not a lot of opportunity for them to be exposed to this. And finally, the last one would be the one about sport and exercise for social change. So they chose male athletes who have spoken out for gender equality. And they talked a lot about different athletes. So LeBron James is in here, Stephen Curry is in here, Kobe Bryant is in here, Andy Murray. So there's a lot of great work that goes into this. The other one that I wanted to share with you was one that I do called a song lyric critique, which is in my gender and sexuality class, because I think it's a fun one for them to do because they don't know much about thinking about how they listen to music and how it represents a lot of sexual innuendos and topics. And this one is this is probably my favorite time I've ever done. But then they all share their music videos in a small group, and then we watch 7 of them and we all analyze them about what it tells us about sexuality in our time through music. And then this is the Working with Diverse Populations syllabus. The one book that I have found that actually I think this, there is a second edition coming out, and I think it's coming out this year. I'm still going to look into it because I think it's a little bit too heavy on the sports medicine side. But this is what I presented to my department. It's pretty comprehensive in terms of what they will do, what their assignments will look like or potentially look like. I think that having this was really helpful because a lot of them don't understand what we will be doing or how it will be graded. And then this is all like institutional stuff. But then I've got, what topics we'll be covering. And even through here, I didn't even cover all the ones that I wanted to. So I'm at 16 minutes and 40 seconds. So I'm going to stop talking so that Liz can get to their presentation. But I will say 2 last things. I think that teaching this stuff is, well, hold on. Oh, nope, sorry. This is what happens. Y'all can see that, right? Hopefully. These are my teaching evaluations from the classes that have these assignments in them. And looking at these afterwards, I get heart palpitations when I think about teaching these classes because I don't know how students will perceive it down here, but it's been very successful. And then for the sake of time, I won't go into my suggested practices. We can do that in maybe a Q&A, or we can talk about it at another time. But these are some things that I utilize in terms of my practices as a professor trying to implement social justice within my courses. Sorry, I talked longer than I planned on, Liz.
You're fine. That was great, Hannah. Thank you. It's gonna take me a second to get mine up. All right. Okay. So I'm going to change gears a little bit, or at least bring in a different perspective. I appreciate how the different perspectives we have. When we first met, we talked a little bit about, was it teaching or the how or the what for social justice? And I think I would have loved talking about both and spending more time, but trying to be cognizant of time, I focused a little bit more on the what I do in my classes. And so I'm starting off here, again, situating sort of my position, which is a little unique at Springfield College. In my position, my tenure track line, I focus only on teaching graduate research methods courses and statistics courses. So on the left, it's all the list of courses I've taught or I've guest lectured in. I teach fewer now that I've moved into administrative roles, mostly statistics courses now, but really all strictly research and stats. On the right, those are the lists of the programs that the students who are in my classes are majoring in. So I have students primarily from our phys ed and health ed department and our exercise science and athletic training department. Every once in a while, I'll have a few from our psych graduate programs as well. And I bring this in because it sort of helped describe why I do this. Pretty much I think of it as three reasons. One, I like talking about social justice in these courses because it's my area of interest and I find it fascinating. So I'm gonna bring what I love into this job. Second, it's the area that I spend the most time reading about. So when I have students ask me questions, often the first area of literature I go to is the literature I know. And so when I'm asked a question about how does this look in the literature, I'm drawing examples from the research I read the most often. And third, I think something that I find really important is if you look through these programs, they'll have some exposure to social justice topics in a few of their classes, but if I think of something like exercise physiology or strength and conditioning and their curriculum, they could, depending on what electives they choose, never have it addressed as a discussion topic. So bringing that discussion lens into these classes really provides an opportunity for those students in particular to get exposure they wouldn't otherwise get. So kind of thinking similarly, I don't know if these are necessarily best practices, but they are the practices I currently have in progress. And I certainly have had some successes and some failures and things I've tried and retried. I sort of lump them into three categories: teaching through examples, teaching or critical analysis of research design and findings, and then encouraging students to do good research. And I'm gonna break those apart. Just in general, when I teach, I tend to tell stories. I think stories is the best way to make things sticky and help students really hold on to the content. One that could come out in case studies, it could come out in stories about my own research or other experiences I've had. And sometimes it just comes out in research examples and really breaking down how a statistic works really specifically through an example. So to give you an example of what that looks like, statistical interaction is probably the most abstract and difficult concept I teach in my master's level stats class. For whatever reason, students were really struggling grabbing hold of the definitions, how it applied, how you tested it. And so I was constantly revising that lecture year in and year out to feel comfortable with it. And then I had been attending a professional development opportunity, and one of the examples was bringing in, it was a social justice professional development opportunity. And one of the examples was talking about how stereotype threat literature is often tested through factorial ANOVA. And I got an idea. So I took the example that I was using in that lecture, and it was informed also by another one of my teaching experiences, which is, I teach this course, I probably taught this course 15, 16 times now. And beginning of the semester, and this happens basically every semester for however many years I've been teaching it, and a student comes up to me and says, you know, Dr. Mullen, I'm really worried. I'm not a math person, and I don't know how this is going to go in this class. And I usually talk them through that. Stats doesn't have a whole bunch of, it's got plenty of computation, but the math isn't that intense, and it's more about the concepts. And after the third or fourth or fifth time of having that conversation, I realized that I was only having those conversations with women students. And it really made me sit back and think about what our culture tells women about their ability to perform in math situations. And so I took this concept from a professional development opportunity and really tried to make it resonate with the students. And I spend a lot of time prepping this example. We talk about stereotype threat. We talk about what it means, how it can be examined and shown in different situations in different populations with different groups. And so it's probably, when I do this, I spend more time than I would typically if I were using VO2 max as an example, or vertical jump, examples that my students all know very well. And what I found, and it started from the first semester I did it, they were leaning forward more. The light bulb moments were happening more. The quality of the questions, the students were asking questions about the content and about the statistics, and the conversations were carrying over afterwards. So they were office hours conversations. They were the conversations we had in the hallway when we were allowed to walk in the hallway with students. They were some of my favorite, I looked forward to that lecture more than I was looking forward to my other lectures. And I realized I could just change my other lectures too. So I really enjoyed that opportunity. And then the bonus was that they also all were getting the questions right on the quizzes and homeworks and exams. And so I was like, this is a win-win. And that has been a really successful practice to bring in examples. I spend a lot of time really teaching them up, but I find that the overall win is big. The second area I do this, is considering the way that I draw critical thinking or critical analysis into these classes. In all of my objectives, course objectives, whether it be research methods or statistics, critical thinking of what you're reading, what's been designed, what does it mean, is a really big piece of this. And so as I was going through my own lectures, my lesson plans, the topic areas that jumped out to me the most, where we have pretty in-depth conversations that really address social justice content and really allow for amazing conversation, areas around ethics and research, as well as research ethics violations. Measurement bias, I think my students get really confused because they know that I really like quantitative measurement, and then they get confused because I tend to then break it down pretty thoroughly and talk about why it's problematic. Sampling, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about reading tables and figures in a second. But in here, the conversations we're really focused on having are who's being included, who's being excluded, and why. Who do the findings benefit? What groups are really going to win from this? What voices aren't being heard through the design? And then ultimately, this is going to lead to my third area. How can we do better? These students all have some form of research capstone project that they need to design. So then how can they in turn do better in their own research? So this is a specific example of how I really try to bring these conversations in. This is from an article published by Lindell and colleagues, 2015. And I used this article on the first day of class in structural equation modeling. My students love me because I send it to them a week before the semester starts in late August, and say that we'll be having this conversation on Monday. And the premise of the article is to represent the field of sport and exercise psychology. And they do some pretty nifty application of some advanced multivariate statistical analysis that we'll be covering in a way that's novel. They pulled 2 or 3 really fun ways of analyzing data to develop their findings. And this is only one of their big findings, but what they're trying to represent here is, and they see it, you can see it a little bit in the very end of the second line here, the overall structural equation modeling, or excuse me, of sport and exercise psychology, where they took all of the citations from the 5 core, what they identified as the 5 core journals in SEP during the 2008-2011 time period, all of the authorship, took those authors, found all of their other citations, and then did some pretty intense network analysis and came up with this, where the circle nodes are kind of the key themes in the literature, and the squares are the researchers associated with the different themes, and then the length and thickness is all about the strength of those associations. And the conversation is great because we get to see these applied statistics really work out. We get this really interesting answer. We talk about the field and how broad it is and where they fit in the field. And then the conversation switches conversation, because then I say, so what's missing? And they kind of look at me because they've just read a whole article that supposedly gives them the entire field and they can map out most of it. And there's kind of that moment of pause of like, wait a minute, we've just missed the point. And then the conversation really gets going when they're able to identify the areas of their niche interest that really aren't on here. And my own particular niche interest isn't on here almost at all. There's very little, the nodes certainly don't represent social justice, and there's a handful of researchers who would do social justice work on here. And so we talk about why. We talk about gatekeeping, and we talk about how the discipline can be reinforced through article or peer review and the elements of those conversations. And it's one of my favorite conversations because that conversation and just the idea of flipping the script on the entire article carries through for the rest of the semester. And then we end up approaching every article that way. So then this leads me to the last quarter of my job. So 1/4 of my workload is working with students for doing thesis and dissertations. I work on a number of committees each year. And I really encourage them as I'm on their committees, and this could be sports psych committees, this could be ex-phys, it could be strength and conditioning, it could be athletic training. Sometimes they do have questions that do have social justice slants, and it's really fun to get into really deep, interesting questions with those students. And sometimes it's just helping them see that they can broaden and consider a more inclusive research design. For example, when students don't want to include women in their physiology research because they don't want to have to deal with accounting for the menstrual cycle. We talk about how that can be better handled. And it can also just be as minimal and easy as writing a good inclusive demographic questionnaire. I give an example here. I'm pulling from a blog that I thought had sort of some nice visuals, but even then not totally perfect. And just enjoy having those conversations and helping them see broader what they can do if they collect good data. And then also how it helps encourage agency in empowering their subjects or participants. So as I thought about how I was going to conclude this, I really struggled for a while. So instead I pulled out a quote that I saw again at a relatively recent different professional development opportunity that resonated with me and really spoke to what I try to do, and brought me to opening the book. So it was a great way to connect with this book. But there is no such thing as a neutral education. Education is either functions as an instrument to bring about conformity or freedom. And certainly not something I say I'm always successful at, but something I continue to strive towards. That brings the end of this presentation, and we are going to switch over to our breakout activity. So for our breakout activity, as we've talked already about the different ways of how and what to teach this, we realize that we are not the experts, and we have a whole bunch of people in this room who have some great experiences, insights, backgrounds, and so on. So we want to hear from you as well. Additionally, we want to leave you with an opportunity to, or have you leave with materials. So these slides are the ideas that we'll be able to share them. I am putting the link to these slides, because we'll all be able to work in them at the same time, in the chat box right now. What we'd like you to do, and this is how I do my breakout rooms in Zoom. I don't go into the rooms anymore because it just shuts down conversation. So I monitor everything from a Google Docs or a Google Slides. What we'd like you to do when you first get into the room, identify a reporter, somebody who is going to be willing to speak and kind of summarize your conversation, as well as somebody who is comfortable typing into the Google Slides. So that person will be your recorder who will be doing the typing. Then during the time, discuss ways you have or you might include discussions of social justice in the sport and exercise psychology classroom. Now, use that broadly to whatever area you'd like to define that as. We've put some potential topics to get you thinking about it, but by all means, feel free to expand on that. And then you're gonna be put into a breakout room with a number. While you're on that number, let's say you're in breakout room 1, go to the slide that's called breakout room 1, and that's where you'll put your bullet points so we can all see. Thanks, Hannah. So that you'll be able to see or have the collection when we're all done of all the different breakout rooms. If we don't all get to report out, but you'll be able to have those. And when the recording gets shared out, Jen, can I give the link to the slides to go with the slides when the recording gets shared out too afterwards?
Absolutely.
Cool. So, and then at the end of 10 or so minutes, we'll pull everybody back and we'll do a quick report out. Questions? Hannah, Tibbs, anything you want to add to that?
I would say when you get to your breakout rooms, introduce yourselves.
Oh, thank you.
How's it going? Where are you? What's your favorite springtime animal? Mine are rabbits.
I also second that. Also, my mom is here. Hi, Mom. So she's not a sports psychology individual, but she's here for support. So she'll give you info.
Awesome. All right. I think we are good to go.
Great.
All right, I am ready to have you all teleport to your new room. So there you go.
Do I want to go?
Yeah, I put you, Hannah, and Liz in the same room.
Okay.
So if you go, you're just going to end up with each other.
Okay.
Does that make it easier for you?
You can just hang here.
Yeah, I might hang here with you. Interesting. Huh. Oh, it's funny to not be the in charge. I'm like, I want to see who's in what room. I want to go join the people's rooms.
Sorry, I have the power.
Do it.
Yeah, but now you're recording us in break.
Oh.